to prevent paper policy expedite and justice of people.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm audible, right? To the room at
Yes.
least. My name is Labisha. I work as a senior research officer at IWMI Nepal. Today I'm going to be presenting our paper on can water, energy, and food policies in support of SIPs or solar irrigation enable gender transformative changes. I will explain what each of these things mean in a while. So essentially, this is a policy analysis from SIP-related policies for the countries of Bangladesh and Nepal. Next slide, please. Why did we do this research? I'll begin with that. Essentially, I think. Louder. Oh, okay. So I'm not loud enough. All right. Essentially, SIP-related research, I think even in the conference we've seen, mostly they're relegated to the more technical parameters of things. We're going to see a lot of research about what is the efficiency of the pump or who is able to finance what kind of pump. We see a lot of things about head and discharge of the pump. But there is a lot less literature or research interest, in fact, on who is actually able to access these pumps, use these pumps. Secondly, SIPs are now considered not only climate-friendly technologies, but also women-friendly renewable energy technologies, because unlike diesel pumps that need to be hauled to the field that require additional labor, SIPs don't need that. You can just click on a switch. Secondly, when we go to the field, we find a lot of women and men talk about how women don't want to be using electric pumps for the fear of shock. I think there's a bit of a gender stereotype involved here, of course, but this is also a note that comes from women themselves. So SIP doesn't have that challenge either, predominantly, let's say. And thirdly, more analysis or policy analysis when it comes to water, energy, and food has been limited to looking at what the policy says in terms of, let's say, allocation or the technology resource, etc. But limited research has been done in terms of gender equality and social inclusion aspects of these sectors. Next slide, please. So essentially, with these things in mind, we formulated this question of can water, energy, food policies in support or relevant to solar irrigation enable gender transformative changes? What do I mean by gender transformative? I will explain in a little while. The sub-questions essentially are how is GESI or gender inclusion and gender equality and social inclusion being conceptualized and incorporated in these sectors, in the water, energy, food sectors, and in the national frameworks such as the Constitution, and how have SIP policy subsidies incorporated GESI? Next slide, please. Essentially, I will talk about how we did what we did. This is the how of it. This is a gender continuum scale, which we've adapted from a number of researchers. So if you see, there is a ranking method from 0 to 3. 0 means that the policy pays no attention to gender or to inclusion. It assumes that whatever is being talked about is gender neutral. So for example, we will see a lot of energy policies assuming that energy is gender neutral, meaning that it does not differentiate between the different levels of use and access between men and women with different kinds of backgrounds. So there is even no limited understanding of gender in these kind of policies. The second step would be the more slightly gender-aware policies, which would show some consideration of gender in these policies, but usually in these policies, gender equals women. It doesn't equal power relations, hierarchy, etc. It is a simple understanding of, oh yes, women have to face certain kind of drudgeries, let's say in farm work, housework, and that's why we need to support this by maybe doing some not really strategic, but more technical fixes kind of thing. The more gender responsive policies will show a slightly deeper understanding of, yes, that this is the kind of levels of burden women and men may be facing. And these are the kind of fixes or strategy we would advance or advise. So for example, this could be like having a 33% representation in, let's say, water user associations, which is very common in the countries South Asia. That is a more gender responsive policy, but we're not really looking at if women are actually able to make decisions in these water user associations. Have we capacitated them? Have we enabled them enough to actually speak up in these forums? Only giving space alone may not be enough. And then at the end of the scale, we have the gender transformative policies. Gender transformative policies would show a very systemic and deeper understanding of the root causes of inequalities, not just for women, but for marginalized men, for men and women across the spectrum. As Gitta was previously saying, which women are we talking about and which men are we talking about is a very important question. So these policies will look at not just creating technical fixes for, let's say, providing SIPs or providing financial modalities. It will look at the institution itself. For example, if it is the energy institution that is giving out these subsidies, it will question its own framework and organization, saying, do we have enough women deciders making these policies? Do we have enough women technicians giving out information to women. So that becomes a more gender transformative approach to the policy. Next slide, please. Now to further complicate things, because that's what we do in qualitative research, we complicate things a little bit. We have decided to go with this domain of change, which is a very usual parameter when you look at GESI related research. They look at three things. They look at agency, which means decision making. And secondly, they look at relations, which is dynamics or power relations between people. And then we look at structure, which is a formal and informal institution. So this could be the government, the state, but also informal institutions, such as the more normative and behavioral aspects of things. We have then conceptualized this into a number of things that we will look at in the policies. So what we are ranking is the 0 to 3 is the ranking methodology. But what are we using? What are we looking at in the policies are these things. So does it promote equitable access to resources and technologies? Does it strengthen representation and voices of women and disadvantaged groups in these institutions? Does it promote GESI and justice in its own strategies? And does it want to improve knowledge capacity and social science and analysis in its own institutional level or not? Next slide, please. So if we looked at policies for water, energy, food, which means predominantly agriculture for Nepal and Bangladesh, but if I go for each sector, we will be here all day. So I'm just going to go to a few of these things and then show you like the average scoring methodology of those two countries. So for instance, here you can see the agricultural policies of Nepal, they scored fairly well, in fact. So when it comes to, let's say, the agriculture development strategy of 2016, it scored very highly across a number of indicators because it shows a very deep level of understanding of what the roots of inequalities are in Nepal, how and why we should be enabling not just women, but also men in various agricultural extension services and how we could do that. So it also says things like, not just in agriculture, but when we are teaching agriculture itself, how do we, let's say, have quotas that for women or disadvantaged communities to be studying agriculture? So it goes a long way. But the reason it goes a long way is that the strategy was actually developed heavily with international partners. It was developed with the UN, it was developed with partners of the CGIR also, I think, because the GESI strategy, which is a companion strategy of the areas, it was developed solely by UN women. So it has this kind of language of inclusion heavily, which is really progressive and interesting. But I think the debate back home is also, what is the uptake of this policy? I mean, it exists and it's a really progressive policy, but the uptake by national partners who are supposed to be implementing this seems to be a little low. I think we're going to do a second phase of the implementation of these policies, which is being planned. Thirdly, next slide, please. However, on the other end of the spectrum, if we look at the energy policies, not just in Nepal, but also in Bangladesh, they've scored very low. Across all of these policies that we looked at, the 8 or 9 policies for Nepal and also for Bangladesh, energy is usually thought of as this gender neutral thing. So it is not conceptualized in the terms of how do men or women access energy. For example, irrigation, questions about that are also related to energy, right? How they use it. Secondly, when there is some mention of gender, it equals woman. And when there is some mention of women, it equals cooking stuffs. So clean cooking. Anytime women are usually mentioned, for example, in the National Energy Strategy, which does a really nice job of understanding the drudgery of housework for women. But then it says that, oh, the way we need to do this is only to provide clean cooking stoves. So for the energy policies, that is the only way to conceptualize gender, at least in the case of Nepal. Next slide, please. When we look at both the countries and we look at the average scores across the indicators, we find, as I was saying, that the food policies are much more progressive than other policies. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, I said, was international development support is very high in the sector of agriculture and particularly in policy making. And that makes the language of these policies quite inclusive, but that may not be sufficient. Secondly, food policies have been developed for a much longer time compared to renewable energy policies, right? So there is a much longer history, for example, even in the countries of India, not just Nepal and Bangladesh, of having had a longer, let's say, agriculture perspective plan before the agriculture development strategy. And then we have all these agri policies and support of that for like 70, 80 years before. So that's the revolution for agriculture has been much longer. The role of women and men, peasants, etc., has been much more recognized in agriculture and food policies, which is why they become more inclusive over time. And then secondly, as I was saying, energy fares very poorly for both the countries, and unfortunately even more poorly for the case of Bangladesh, where there is almost, I think you can see that there is no indication of any inclusion-related interest. However, I say Nepal fares slightly better, but you will find out later that this is not a great scenario as well. And then for the case of water, they're usually gender aware. They fare tending towards gender aware, so they have this technical fixes of saying things like, yes, we need women 30% representation in this, and but that has been happening for the last several decades, and there is only research that shows that this is only turning out to be tokenism, and it's not really enabling women in these positions. Next slide, please. We also looked at SIP financing mechanisms in the two countries, and these are the most popular ones across the two countries. So for in the case of Nepal, we have the subsidy and grant model. So the renewable energy policy provides a 60% grant for SIPs, but this is a flat blanket subsidy. So there is no targeted modality of finding out which farmers are supposed to get this. And as Gitta has also already stated, that most of these subsidies are appropriated by elites. And then the second problem is, because they do not have a specific selection criteria, it depends on whoever is running the project that year. So for example, if I'm a very benevolent project manager and I'm running the SIP financing modality that year, then I could say, okay, why don't we give more subsidies to women this year? Which has been happening in Nepal right now, because we do find that 20 to 25% of these SIPs are going to women, but that is not a consistent factor. It will probably change once that project manager is replaced. So this allows for a discretionary selection criteria when it is not specified in the policy, and it may ultimately hamper smallholder access. Second, we have rent-to-own models, which are popular in a couple of countries in South Asia, not just in Nepal and Bangladesh, which is being piloted a lot of times by development agencies. So I think in Nepal, we had Windrock partner with private organizations, and in Bangladesh as well, there are a number of private players that give these funds to farmers, and then for a lower upfront cost, and then the farmer over harvest time or over throughout a number of seasons pays the institution back. This is a lower upfront cost, and this could be a good financing mechanism, potentially for smallholder farmers, but if the payment flexibility time is high. For example, if the harvest fails, then what? We need to have these factors also into consideration. Then we have the grant plus loan models, where half of it is a loan and half of it is a grant, piloted by organizations such as IWMI. This may also be helpful for smallholder farmers, and there is a little bit of research ongoing right now, but doesn't really have substantial proof. The fee-for-service model, which is a more popular model in Bangladesh, which is the water selling model. So you have these private companies, you have these NGOs as well, that sell water to sharecroppers in particular. And I was saying that Bangladesh energy policies may not look very gender inclusive. However, the practice that they are doing is in fact more inclusive, because around 36% of those buying this water are sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So even in terms of policy, we would say one thing, but in terms of practice, this is something that would be piloted in Nepal as well, and we are trying to do that. And then we have some cases of women targeted subsidies. For example, in the case of IWMI, who gave a 10% higher subsidy, as Tarai has already explained about, and that is a more targeted subsidy and has, at least in a few cases, help women engage with the technology a little bit better. Next slide, please. I think I've said pretty much almost everything, but generally, if I have to conclude, we can see that both constitutions, the national frameworks, essentially, they're highly progressive. The language is highly progressive. They talk a lot about gender, and not just in the terms of women, but in terms of power and hierarchy between men and women, and who has been made subservient to whom, and how we need to enable this disenfranchisement or disable this disenfranchisement, I mean. But when we look at the sectoral level policies in water, energy, food, we find that they are not at the same place where the level of constitutions or national frameworks are. And then they show a limited understanding collectively in operationalizing these constitutional mandates. There are heavy policy gaps that I've already talked about, which, if addressed, for example, by targeting these policy subsidies towards more smallholder farmers, creating financing mechanisms that would be effective for smallholders. Because at the end of the day, Nepal and Bangladesh, they're all held up by smallholder farmers rather than large and big farmers, right? So if they are, enabled on these socially responsive, equitable qualifications, then only they would move towards, making an actual change. So GESI integration is essential in solar irrigation financing, as I've already said, and these frameworks can be useful, hopefully, for improving the understanding and capacity of policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Running any burning question or queries to Larissa?
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to know, is there any kind of data or any assessment of, suppose there are 100 number of sites that have been installed, what percentage are, say, owned by women? Anybody has?
Yes, we have done that. So the solar project at IWMI, it started with a rapid assessment of this, and it's about, I would say, 21 to 25%.
Now the 25
Yeah. So she's asking the percentage.
8%.
So 20 to 25% is owned by women.
In Nepal.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not 25.
But as I was saying, this discretionary criteria that would like either enable it or disable it. 1 year it is higher, the other it is lower, so it is not consistent because of a lack of actual policy.
You guys.
Yes.
Please show the slide where you basically identified those indicators.
Yes.
Yeah. So this, so this one, so the indicator 1.1, 1.2. So that.
1 point is missing there in the main.
No, I'm just saying the indicators.
Yeah.
This is the result, right?
Yeah.
Go up. Can you go back?
Go on.
Yeah, this one. Yes.
So how did you arrive at the indicator? How did you arrive at you go ahead and look at the exhaustiveness of the indicators or whether this is adequate or whatever?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I think even now we are still questioning a lot of the tweaks of the methodology. The domain that you see here is the most used domains when it comes to gender related research. So they typically look at agency relations and structure. And these links that you see here, they come from a number of other research papers that we study, and we sort of like combined these frameworks to see what commonalities arose from them, and then created this kind of list. But I have to say that
weights gave, how giving equal weights.
right now we are giving it equal weights. We did try a weighted method as well, but for some reason that did not seem to work out as well because we didn't. Because then we had to find out a way of what weightage to give each indicator, and that, yeah.
How do you aggregate? You went for a linear aggregation?
Yes, this is a linear aggregation.
Can be problematic for the kind of research we're doing because scoring a very low in one of the indicators can be compensated by a high score in other indicators.
Yes.
But in practice,
yes,
that might be problematic.
Yes.
So there are other methods of aggregation. And of course, HPI, for example, does a geometric mean. And others,
right.
This idea.
Right.
So you may explore some of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are in fact also exploring it if we want to go for a weighted methodology, but thank you. Next.
Yes.
I think
Okay, mine is rather a comment, but this is very interesting aspect, and I think it's something which we can also adopt in our country. But I think the trick is on the land ownership aspect, especially in our country, because this is one of the things which I've since realized that the Asian aspect in terms of land ownership is totally different with Africa. Yes.
How is it back home?
We have what we call freehold, and then we have got the title deed, land ownership.
Okay.
So the freehold one is you don't have a title deed to it, but you own the land by inheritance.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, but I think this is a very good tool which you can also apply. But the issues to do with the relations on that aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what is the problem?
I think we could definitely contextualize it, but it would depend on like what kind of indicators you want to look at, and you can base it for the reality of your country. We could talk later as well. Thank you
Just
so
to
much.
add, also, in each indicator, we have defined what does it mean. It has more than 5-6 indicators, contextualizing Nepal and Bangladesh. And we all gender researchers review policy. We had a core validate the count, word count. Also yesterday I presented one slide because our judgment may not be very much contested or question. And then we also did another approach, word count, and review of our scoring analysis by other expert from Bangladesh, for example, non-gender.
Yes, because we were
Confirm
Nepal.
the provision and also make sure that scoring what we did is very. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much.
Jen?
One thing.
Yes. Can I take this use suspender? No. No, it's fine. I will just, yeah. Yeah. Close this first. Stop share. So start by saying that please pardon a very scattered presentation from my side. I have panelist names and custodian names and rapporteur names. That's like neon light in my head giving me brain freeze. My intellectual capacity is at very low points. And I'm very glad that we started with Labisha because she's already covered a lot of because they sort of set the stage for the kind of work that we started to do in India. Now in India, we haven't really done as much detailed field work and the data part of it, but we wanted to look at not necessarily just SIP related, but we want to give it a bigger sort of a nexus context. So the fact is that when you talk about solar irrigation being inclusive, that inclusivity doesn't just come from solar, it comes from food, it comes from agriculture, it comes from, like I said, nutrition, water. So the entire nexus is what gives it the inclusiveness. It's also what takes away, right? So it is within that nexus that we really understand what inclusive means for solar. So today, my presentation is going to be focused more on this nexus policies. Why is inclusion in terms of SIP is really considered important for India, and why is it context specific? I think anyone who's worked in India knows that irrigation, especially groundwater access, has long been established to be highly unequal, for women. Gender relations and traditional gender division of work tends to take, while it puts in a lot of labor and time and burdens on women, it takes them away from control and decision making in agriculture. So when we talk about work, women being more involved in work and there's more participation, it's also important in what element, and that element is really missing. And the Indian sort of gender framework
the social framework that gender works in India really brings that out. The other thing that's become really important now is the kind of agrarian distress that a lot of rural India is now facing, which tends to have men leaving the villages. And that has been so often called as feminization of labor. It's not happening because essentially what has happened is they got left behind. And they got left behind with the worst of the situation when everything is no longer profitable, very highly burdened. That's when women got left behind with it. So when we talk about gender feminization of labor and talk in really flowery terms about how women's positions getting better, we really have to consider these kind of contexts as well within the region. The other thing is with solar, I think we've already discussed that over many sessions, that it has a lot of opportunities that it could potentially bring. And the idea is that whether women can sort of really benefit from the opportunities of solar, or will they again get, captured by men? The way you've got elite capture within the households, you also have men who end up capturing a lot of benefits. So there are opportunities for co-benefits for women, because in the case of women, reproductive and productive work generally works across a continuum. So often we tend to categorize them the household work and the productive work. But for women, it's all within a continuum. So the kind of co-benefits with domestic water, with livestock, with homestead lands, and part of the household also that solar irrigation pumps can offer can really have, a lot of benefit for women within the household when we stop considering it as just an irrigation source, but look at water in general. So okay, I will move past these because I think Labisha has already done a great job. So let me start with the fact that in India, the policy environment is, having gone through almost 70 years of policy making, is a very complex, when you start doing policy analysis in India, you're looking at so many different levels of policy. You've got the state, you've got the central, then you've got certain sectors which are dealt with by the state. Some sectors where decision making is happening from the center. The state might want to do something, but they can't because the center has dictated it. Or the center has dictated one policy and the state says, well, we don't want to listen to it, we do it our own way. So policy analysis in general, when you look at a framework, can get very complex, but at the same time, it also offers a lot more opportunity because you have the opportunity to not be completely centralized. So let's see if, general has scope there. So in India, what we really need to overcome when it comes to inclusion context is, so for instance, we have land. So it starts from the very base, from resource ownership. Then you can look at work participation, the type of activities that women are generally involved in, access to inputs, access to credit, involvement in extension, participation, decision making, whether they get trained. So there's a whole range of things that form the base for gender exclusion aspects. It's not just whether women are getting the technology or not, but even when they do get it, they are playing in all of these categories. So when you say that small farmers or small landholders are going to get a particular technology, but women aren't owning the land at all, then where is the inclusion going to come from? So the need to identify gender as intersections, not just as women, but as intersections among small farmers, among large farmers, amongst those being trained, amongst those having access to credit, is very important. So this is just some of the data that we have found, the general inequality in terms of access to these very, very basic resources on which all of the solar technology is then going to come. So you've got merely 5% of women farmers who were issued Kisan credit cards. I mean, that is your percentage of access to credit. So when you're going to stop subsidizing your technology, where is the credit going to come from? Who is going to access private capital? Only 25% of participants were women in training and farm schools. So if you're going to start with structural issues at this level, then your inclusion is not just about, like I said, whether women are getting solar irrigation or not, but whether you have also started to deal with these structural aspects. That's where the next thinking and policy really comes from. I don't want to go through, we've got media people here who have written years on constitution and what go wrong here. But let me say that, so there are certain frameworks that are offered by national policy frameworks. So whether it's a constitution, whether it's a planning documents, they do have progressive language, as Labisha mentions, and everybody who works on the field knows that it does not always, move on. But we also know that getting that progressive language into policy has taken decades and decades and decades of fight. So every time a single word changes in a policy document, you know that it has a 60-year history of battles behind it. So I think that a progressive language in your larger national policy framework has promise, it has opportunity, it has a document that you can actually say that, well, can I claim rights or can I claim a better policy based on it? So the constitution in India, of course, offers a lot of these, right down to, decentralized governance. You can have more equity at the grassroots levels. And there's a lot more inclusion just in terms of the general language. There is the national plans, whether you've got Niti Aayog, there's a lot of language around improving female, labor force. There are a lot of these positive policy aspects that they've brought in for more gender inclusion. Other than that, India signed up on these various other frameworks, whether it's CEDAW, whether it's the International Covenant of Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. These have all got positive aspects that can be built on for gender inclusive frameworks. What we found also interesting was there's a new draft national policy for women that came out in 2016. It's not gone through, but it has interestingly newer systemic ways of looking at gender, which again is interesting. But the fact that there's a separate national policy for women automatically makes other people assume, well, we don't have to take care of women because there's already a separate policy for women, and let's just let that policy take care. So this is where we come from, is that what does this framework give and take away from potential grassroots level potential grassroots level work, as well as other policies, sectoral policies. So there are a lot of good things it does offer. For instance, focus on participation in decision making. Women are asked to give quotas in decision making. There's intersectionality in gender identity. The Constitution, for instance, says, well, you should include women, but they should also be from the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribe, certain percentages. So there are small aspects of intersectionality that does come up in these documents. And if sectoral policies can learn how to pick these up, you don't even have to get UN or CGIR to give you policy documents. You already have them within your own constitution. You can get the language there. There's an emerging shift from individual agencies. So like I said, in National Policy of Women, they've actually looked at, for instance, societal attitudes. They've moved to start thinking about societal attitudes and mindsets, engagement with men and boys, and not just, they didn't just talk about women, but also talked about including men. Equal power sharing. They would talk about vision sees women as participating as equal partners. So when you start thinking of gender as relational, you know that we've moved a step beyond looking at gender as women. So these are all promising aspects. But at the same time, look at the constraints that our national policies generally, put on sectoral policies. Number one, like I said, there's a lot of preoccupation with women, except for in the policy for women. There's a lot of high concentration of gender in nutrition, sanitation, and health, and things like that. So it has that connotation that, well, women's space is there. Let's just deal with that. So whenever they talk about gender, immediately you're going to have somebody come up with nutrition. Oh, but women are the holders of ration cards and things like that. I said, yeah, but you're constantly going back to the traditional sectors, the traditional reproductive household sectors. Inclusion in work participation is still weak. So they just assume that vocational training and skill development is what's going to get women there. And it really isn't, because the structural issues are so much that, if they do not have access to resources, like we discussed in so many of our solar irrigation farms, that if you do not have access to land, then you're never going to be the recipient, irrespective of how much skill development you have. And there's a lot of isolated treatment of GSI, that there are always, even in policy documents or in planning documents, you find a separate chapter. Social inclusion, gender, women. There's a separate chapter which automatically tells that nobody else has to deal with this part. This chapter will deal with it, and it will be said. But so, which is what we find, that in the economic sectors in your planning documents, there's no inclusion of, there's no inclusion of caste and marginalities or gender, because this chapter takes care of it. So this has also shown up in a lot of our policies. So I don't want to go into the ranking. But let me bring out some of the basics that we found when it came to the sectoral policies. water policies, which for years and years we've been looking at gender-water relations. It recognizes basic right to water, but provides no measure to ensure it. So it just says we need to do this. There continues to be a high focus on the hydroclimatic and technical aspects of water. And gender inclusion is very weak, which is something that I was not expecting when I started reading the policies, because there's so much of literature on gender water. Only the groundwater bill has mentioned gender at all in here. However, agriculture sector, I think similar to Nepal as well, has generally been much richer in terms of gender. So because gender in labor is one major factor, and gender nutrition. So these are the two things that make agriculture policies a gender sort of responsible. However, what we find in India that between the last 2007 policies to 2017, there's been a deterioration. In the last 8 to 10 years, the kind of policies that we've come up with, it's all about doubling farmers' income. So there's no mention of small, large farmers. It's just across the board, the kind of language that they use, stakeholders, farmers, it's across the board. Climate change missions, forget it. No mention of anybody. It's just about climatic factors and adaptation for who, God knows. So, and energy sector, initially, so what we found was that there was an equity concern when the whole focus of the energy sector policies was on household electrification. When it came to households, they had this understanding that there is inequality and there are the poor. But now that we have moved from the household to the field, they're like, our electrification is now done. So electrification means household electrification is now done. Now you're going to move into renewable energy and farm. We have again gone back to absolute basic level, technocratic policy level, which is very, very technical documents on discoms, on distribution, on who has access, so there's no people involved really in the policies. So what we also found is similar to the discussion yesterday, is that energy policies have also deteriorated, but the shift to renewable energy has completely taken away all focus on people, let alone gender. There are no people in that whole document, right? So thank you for bringing out this ranking thing, but please don't take the numbers seriously, but I think the valid point here is just this comparison to see which sector really does not have space for gender at all, and not just gender, but inclusion in general. So there's obviously no mention of different caste groups, different access to, whether it's power or land. So we have energy that is clearly much, much lower than anything else. Energy doesn't even show up on most of our indicators. I will move away from this and go straight to the takeaways. So I think the things that we need to move on to now is number one, that there are a lot of progress and transformative components in our national frameworks that we can utilize. We don't have to fight from scratch. We don't need brand new policies. They're already existing. And are there ways in which we can mobilize? Number two is that there are a lot of gaps in national frameworks which can teach us on how to do our sectoral frameworks better. Can we do our sectoral policies better, having learned from the mistakes the national frameworks have made over the years of evolution of that? There continues to be a focus on proximate manifestations of unequal access, that, women don't have resources or skills, and therefore the responses are also very proximate. It does not look at why women don't have the skills or why women don't have resources. Gender blind energy sector policies, I've moved into that. I want to bring out this, which I had discussed in the beginning, that identifying reproductive and productive and the continuum for gender inclusion is very important. The fact that we separate the farm and production from the household is a terrible thing that we do, because by the very choice of that sampling, we have already excluded women from the productive space. So, when we look at agri-food systems, there's this other project that I'm working on. They're like, oh, no, we're not working with homesteads. I'm like, but why? Homesteads also need to get irrigated. They also need water. Women are carrying buckets of water to irrigate their, the vegetables that they are growing that provides entire nutrition for the household. So this initial sampling that as researchers we do, where we separate out the farm from the household, is in its very essence, a problem. So we have to look at if you want to include women in benefits of anything, you have to look at the productive and the household together. And finally, using this nexus sort of thinking is really important to look at gender, because like we saw that gender terrible in energy, better in agriculture. So there are different sectors that inclusion really comes from. So you have to look at it in terms of a nexus to see whether inclusion, where does it lack? So you can have very, good inclusion of gender in agriculture where it does not help if it's not there in water or if it's not there in energy. So this sort of nexus thinking is very important, that we need to look at all of the sectors together rather than just looking at how many times women are mentioned. So I will end there, and I hope I make some sense.
Maybe only one question, and then Marlene present. After Marlene presentation, we can discuss the first hand and other things.
Sure, just, one of the things that we have as a problem in India, particularly, but also across South Asia, is very low labor participation rate of women, right? And I think there's a kind of a chicken and egg situation here, because there is no labor participation, there's no leverage to push political action. And frankly, you can have the best policy in the world, but if a person doesn't get some money and independence from it.
Completely.
So have you examined how, let's say, renewable or water policies can create employment opportunities with gender inclusion, or with that lens, or not?
So I think when we go down to the field, that becomes an important question. But like I said, the policy doesn't even mention people. So I don't even know where to go looking for women or gender, or even like a could be defined as something. Let's find out. There's no mention of human beings in a lot of these policies. So it gets a little difficult to move to nuances of what you're talking about. But at the same time, I would like to say that labor, understanding gender and labor becomes very important, like I said, in terms of the quality of labor. There's so much of talk about having women as labor. Women are already there in the fields. They've been doing the grunt work for centuries. And it's just the definitions that keep changing on what does labor include.
Yeah.
The definitions keep changing. You suddenly have 70%. Somebody says, oh, they collect water, so they are labor. It's 90%. Somebody does not include it. It's 20%.
Let me just say, making money out of it. And
It's
then-
not
and
targeted approach to enable women to access to income or paid over.
Yeah.
We have a sub criteria
Yes.
also to look
Can
at.
I also just add, earlier question about how many women own SIPs in Nepal? I did say around 25%, but the fact is that these are bonds given by the government in the name of women. And that is a distinction from if actually women use them or not, because when we go to the field, we find that it's come in the name of women, and sometimes not even of the same family. Some other person, some landowner perhaps, has appropriated that.
Data.
So it may say 20%, but the actual value is even lower.
So in India, we have this concept of the
Let us thank you.
Marlene, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks for being here. Right, so I'm going to repeat some of the things you've already heard, but I'm also going to take a slightly different take on all this.
Yes.
So this is not based on fieldwork. This is it's a desk study that we conducted. This is strange. Okay. So what we did is we reviewed paper on gender and energy and inclusion, about 100 papers that came up whilst, we did various searches. And we also then looked at policy in Nepal specifically in the energy sector. So first there is some discussion around what we found in terms of GESI and energy, and then what happens in Nepal. So the main lesson, I think, from the literature review is that we need to look beyond gender, right? We need to look, what I mean by that is that the studies that have been done in Nepal on adoption and the impact of adoption, first of all, there are very few studies. There's lots of studies that says, so many women do this, so many women are involved, etc. But there are actually very few studies that actually look at the impact of that adoption. So we need to look beyond gender because, for example, here I'm using 3 examples. One is a study on biogas adoption, which was done in Nepal. And what it shows is there is a correlation between Brahmin men-headed household and the remoteness and access to roads, access to market, access to land, also the access to livestock that plays a role. So it's not just gender that matters, but it's all these other factors that need to be considered. Similarly, a study on adopting cooking. Again, caste issue and economic status plays a big role, but also endowment, education, and ownership, right? So again, we need to think when we talk about gender and inclusion, we need to think beyond gender. And what we see in this particular study is Dalit households are less likely to adopt, and Madheshi Dalit households are even less likely to adopt. So within Dalits in Nepal, you also have hierarchies. So it just shows how this inclusion is challenging. And a study that's a little bit older has actually looked at different constraints that has categorized different types of exclusion. So different groups in Nepal experience exclusion in different ways, and for some, language barrier is an issue, and issues also in Nepal. You have issues of citizenship. You have quite a big proportion of people who live at the Indian border in the Tarai who do not have citizen papers, and that actually precludes them from having access to all sorts of other benefits like subsidies or like government programs. And then also, again, Dalits may face issues of, it's almost like an incremental issue that Dalit may face issues of language and citizenship, but also there are untouchables. So even though untouchability is no longer legal in Nepal, it's still practiced quite heavily. And women, they face all of the above, plus gender-based violence. So being a woman in Nepal is not simple. So the question we were trying to, that comes from the literature, okay, is does energy switching actually support empowerment? Does it deliver empowerment for women? And of course, how do you define empowerment? That depends a little bit on different definitions. But I think for us, what we consider empowerment is really something that will challenge, that will deliver gender equality, and that understands that men and women should have equal rights, equal access to resources, and the power to influence, right? And this is important in the area of energy. And also, which I think Gitta talked about, is the practical versus strategic needs. You know, practical needs are you create a tap, so that helps women save them time, but it actually changes nothing in terms of their decision making or access to resources. Whilst you can have approaches that will be more strategic, like for example delivering land title for women, that actually is strategically very important because that then allows them to access credit, have collateral, and therefore that actually really transforms the situation of women. So always think about practical versus strategic needs. So does energy switch support empowerment? Well, from the literature that exists on Nepal, but also in other countries, there is no clear evidence one way or the other. So there may be less drudgery and more free time, but there are other constraints such as mobility. Remember what I said before, think beyond gender. You know, if you don't have mobility, if there is no economic opportunity where you live, if you have less assets, less education, all these actually block women, but also disadvantaged group from benefiting potentially from this energy switching. So, and there is no evidence of change in gender relations. So remember when we talk about empowerment, really we want to change is this transformative approach that my colleagues have talked about. So an interesting paper also, a lot of people say, yeah, it's great since we have electrification, we have, people can access appliances, and again, that will reduce women drudgery. But there is a very interesting article that was done in, I can't remember now whether it's India or Nepal, which looked at different choices that households make in terms of what do they do when they have electricity and they have a bit more money, what kind of appliance they buy. And it was perfectly okay for women to buy rice cookers because that's their job to cook rice. But it was men who would decide whether we would buy a TV or not, or a smartphone or not. But I think more problematic is that in some groups where they did the study, the men were controlling what women were allowed to watch on TV. So having a TV in the household does not necessarily mean women would access TV. However, there was another study that was comparing India and Afghanistan, and that was really surprising outcome to me, at least, given all the things we hear about Afghanistan, is that Afghan women had access to TV and used TV programs to be aware of what was happening in Afghanistan, to open their mind to other things, while Indian women were constrained because the men were controlling what they could access on TV. So who controls the remote? Huh? Who controls the remote? We used to say who controls the pen, but now we say who controls the remote. So I think for me, one thing that has come up in this review is the question of policy, and we will come to this, is when you try to understand why there is this resistance to gender or to GESI, there are three what we call here interlocking barriers. So one is what we call a pragmatic, what the author, Payne, calls a pragmatic barrier, which means a policymaker, a decision maker in a department doesn't have enough money, it's not a priority, so we don't really invest in it. We don't necessarily against it. We're not anti-gender equality, but this is not a priority. I don't have time. I don't have money. Therefore, we don't actually measure properly. We don't invest in collecting the evidence that would help us making appropriate decisions, right? So this means that because we have a gap of data, because there is no interest in investing, there is a serious gap in the conceptual understanding. And I think that comes across from what my colleagues have said, that gender does not equal women. Gender is about the power relationship between men and women. And if you have a gender lens, that's what you want to look at, right? But if you don't have that understanding, that 1 + 2 equal to GESI blind policies, because you don't have the data and you don't have the conceptual understanding of what gender lens really is. And therefore, when you design your studies, you're not unable to develop proper policies. So gender equal women also has been said by my colleagues, women equal victims, so they're either victims or potential economic agent. There are markets, so we need to target women because they will buy, they will consume, right? So no attention to intersectionality. I think that has been already demonstrated. And also what's very important in policy is there is a division or a divorce or between policies in the nexus. So, for example, you may have energy policies, and I'm going to talk about it, but it doesn't show how it's linked to others. So you have a chapter on gender, but then you have everything else that happens here. And I think that has also been talked to. And I think what is missing in policies is what I call here the causal pathways. There is no policy that explains if you really want to have an inclusive approach to energy, these are the steps you need to follow, right? We say, oh, we need to be inclusive, great, but there is no explanation how you get it. And also nothing about how it will change gender roles or livelihoods. So quickly, an interesting historical thing here, as some of my colleagues have already said, the first time the issues of rural women are mentioned in Nepal in energy policies is 2006, right? So that's 14 years ago, okay? Before that, no women at all. In 2014, the issue of representation. So often, as also been said before, when we talk about gender, we have a number. It's what we call bums on seats, right? If you have so many women in a meeting, it's great, right? You're being participatory. The very and only policy on GESI is from the Alternative Energy Promotion Committee or Commission. That is really good, surprisingly good. But it's very recent, therefore we don't really know how far it's been implemented, and that's something we'll be looking at. Then you have more policies since then, and the policies subsequent to this one, absolutely gender, I mean, I'm not going to say gender blind, but there is hardly anything. So that means there is no learning, there is no sharing, there is a silo within the energy sector, right? And we have heard before about how agriculture is much more advanced in Nepal or in Bangladesh or in India, but there is no fertilization, there is no cross-fertilization between governments, between those sectors. And that is something that I find very, very surprising. So I'm not going to go through this, just to show that this is a really good policy. So I think what also comes up very strongly, and I think Manu mentioned it in the panel yesterday or in one of the sessions, is that the focus of energy innovation is on addressing practical needs, right? And it's not actually thinking in terms of transforming the gender relationship. So because the focus is technocratic or technology focused, even though they may say we need to include or be inclusive, the approach, the method that are using, the process that is put in place is not, cannot deliver inclusion because it's technology focused. And for example, people are not involved in the design of technologies. People are they're given pumps and they're given 3 models of subsidies, and then we are going to watch how you're going to use them. But how many people have actually sat with farmer and say, okay, here is solar, we can get energy, we can get electricity from the sky. Okay, so what kind of pump, what kind of technology, what kind of model do you think fit within your conditions? We don't do that. This is 1960s development, right? This technology focused, top-down, expert-driven development. I know that's not very popular what I'm saying here, but so we need to be more people-focused, basically, people-centered. So what in terms of moving ahead, I think what we see from the literature is that there is not enough studies looking at the intra-household dynamics. So we're looking at, as we said before, like, okay, how many women do this and how much money is earned or additional income to the household, but we don't discuss, or we don't have data on what happens in terms of decision making within the household. There is also not enough action research testing, and that's, I believe very strongly that we need to, if we really want to include landless people, illiterate people, poor people who are downtrodden, who are completely excluded, who have no access on anything, if we really want to include them, we need to work with them to develop models and study how this process can happen. I think that is really important. And I think also for me, we really need to understand this institutional process. Why is it that we have these macro policies that are in Nepal, the GESI policy is very progressive, the constitution is very progressive, and we've been talking about gender and social equity 20 years, 25 years. We have in the forestry sector, we have GESI guidelines, we have everything, it, and yet you still have in 2022 policies that are gender blind. So what is happening in this institutional process? Where are the gaps? Where are the bottlenecks? People know when you talk to people, they nod when you talk to bureaucrats and etc. Everybody nods, but no one actually wants to do anything about it. So that will finish shortly. Thanks.
Before we start our point, we need to meet Marlene during lunchtime because it's time. Close here. Thank you so much for attending this session. or anyone has very burning issue or very curiosity about such that Marlene and team go.